Trump goes to North Carolina and California. Hey, it's sort of like that book you read in high school, Tale of Two Cities. Trump sets DC on its heels with the fastest week in history. Trump appointees start to run the gauntlet in DC. This is Dr. David D. Schein for Saving America with our weekly update. And what a week it has been. Trump goes to North Carolina and California. Hey, it's sort of like that book you read in high school, Tale of Two Cities. North Carolina welcomed President Trump warmly. They were facing threats of being homeless last week due to FEMA threatening to end temporary housing. He criticized the ineffectual and slow actions of FEMA. In fact, he even mentioned getting rid of FEMA since it has not been helping North Carolina. North Carolina, as you know, took the worst of Hurricane Helene, which marched up the East Coast months ago. He promised more help and quickly. He also mentioned sending the Army Corps of Engineers to get the roads and bridge reconstruction going. Folks, it's been a slow road over in Western North Carolina, and that shouldn't be happening to our American citizens. Trump then flew to California, where Governor Newsom met him as he landed. The story had been that Trump did not plan to meet with him. Not sure if that had been true. The death toll in California, sadly, has now reached 29. While the damage is likely to be as much as $200 billion, Trump's interaction with Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles was an interesting contrast of how to be a real president and how not to be a mayor of any city, much less a huge city. Trump demanded that California require ID to vote in order to get federal aid. I'm not sure how that's going to work out. I hold the mindless governors of California responsible for the damages and deaths in California. Decades of poor forest management and failure to address California's chronic water issues produced this result. Of course, an electorate stupid enough to elect Newsom, Bass, and now Schiff as senator has found out that elections have consequences. The tagline of one commentary I read caught my eye. The same politicians responsible for LA's destruction shouldn't be overseeing its rebuilding. Even though Bass has now promised to expedite permits and reduce red tape to help reconstruction, does any sensible person believe her? The other issue is the huge cost of building in California, and now it'll be even more expensive given the massive damage and needs. With famous actors with mansions competing for scarce resources, will the average person have a chance to rebuild anytime soon? All the rest of us can do is to hope things will turn out better in North Carolina and California, but each state needs to focus on using its own resources effectively. If there's a silver lining to the fires in California, as I've mentioned before, we are seeing Newsom's governorship go up in smoke, literally. That will hopefully mean nobody will ever consider him as a presidential candidate. Not that I did before this tragedy, of course. Trump sets a record with executive orders. That's been a headline all over the place. Even though Trump promised a huge batch of executive orders on day one, much of the press keeps acting amazed at the pace with which this has taken place. I do note that Joe the Demented did about the same on his first day, doing his best to destroy what Trump had done in his first term. Turnabout is fair play in both directions, folks. I do want to condemn the political situation in America where there is no cooperation between the parties. Running the world's largest economy with executive orders is simply wrong. There should be an orderly legislative process that focuses on what is best for the people of America. Of course, the courts have already jumped in and blocked a handful of his orders. Most recently, Trump tried to stop federal grants. This became confused because some claimed there would be a stop to Social Security and Medicare, which was false, of course, still created a bit of a stir over there. With the stroke of a pen, he eliminated LBJ's Executive Order 11246, which created an affirmative action requirement for government contractors along with a bureaucracy to enforce it. I agree with this action as this made sense at the point that LBJ did it, but even the libs' favorite former SCOTUS justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, predicted that the time would be up soon for affirmative action. Well, it is now. Even if a Democrat follows Trump, I doubt it will be reinstated. In the interest of full disclosure, I am an expert on affirmative action plans and the compliance requirements. But in the last few years, there's been little call for my services in this area in any event. In other words, things in the industry have sort of floated away, and it's about time to put that cow down. The death of DEI was rapidly approaching in the private sector, and Trump has pretty much put the nail in the coffin for the public sector. The departing Biden administration tried to keep it in place by covering it up, but I do not think those efforts will last very long. Often haste makes waste. The effort to reduce the federal workforce is already a mess, in my opinion. First, Trump told federal workers to come back to work in the office. That made sense. The idea was that many would quit rather than return. However, before that could work, he then announced a far too generous severance plan. This is offering federal workers 8 months of pay and benefits to quit now. Some of those positions actually need to be filled. I predict the best and the brightest will probably take the money and go to the private sector. But the losers who cannot compete in the private sector will be left on our payroll. This is not the right way to redone a reduction in force, also known as a RIF. In fact, that is part of my personal expertise, but of course, the folks in Washington didn't bother to ask me. We will continue to provide frank commentary as this administration proceeds. Nobody and nothing is off limits in either direction. Trump appointees start to run the gauntlet in D.C. The coverage of the RFK hearings have been nearly hilarious as the Democrats jump on their former Democratic colleague and even Caroline Kennedy, as if anybody cared. I remember little Caroline when she was the little daughter of JFK and Caroline and Jackie Kennedy up in Washington, D.C. Well, she's now a hardened old lady, and she's saying bad things about her uncle, and I think it's a sad commentary on that family. In any event, we'll see how that turns out. ICE raids have begun in earnest, as promised by Trump and one of his key appointees, Tom Homan. His new boss is Kristi Noem, who's been approved as the head of DHS. Most know that she served in Congress and was the governor of South Dakota most recently. She got to work fast as she even appeared the very next day at an ICE raid in New York City. I'm going to suggest right now that the brilliant, articulate, and awfully good-looking conservative Kristi Noem might be our first female president. Once these illegals are picked up, time to dump them out of the country. In a fascinating one-day interaction, Trump sent 2 military planes to Colombia with the trash collected by ICE. Their socialist president, Petro, said that the plane could not land since the inmates were being shackled on the planes. Remember that these were convicted criminals, not just illegals. Hey, somebody mentioned the movie Con Air. Yeah, let's not have these criminals running around in the airplanes. Doesn't sound like a good idea. Remember, these were convicted criminals, not just illegals. So Trump said he would slap a travel ban on key officers of Colombia, along with 25% tariff on everything from Colombia immediately, and make it 50% shortly thereafter. By the way, a couple key imports from Colombia are flowers and coffee. A few hours later, Colombia's president offered to send his personal plane for the criminals. Raids have continued across the country, including our base here in Houston, Texas. Generally, the reaction of the public has been good. Of course, there have been some hysteria about illegals who are not convicted criminals being picked up at the same time. My sympathy is not there. Further, the concept that illegals are doing the work that Americans won't do is flawed. For instance, for agriculture, America has had a guest farm worker program in place for decades. And what about all those who played by the rules and came here legally? I understand there may be some restaurants and hotels which will have to start playing fair by paying everybody who works there legal wages. I fully support that. I do not work with any employer who employs illegals or attempts to avoid the wage laws here in the United States. We should be supporting that policy. In an announcement that will surprise absolutely nobody, except maybe Joe the Demented, the CIA now favors the lab leak theory on the origins of COVID-19. John Ratcliffe, the new director of the CIA, has declassified the latest announcement for public release. So the CIA has now joined the FBI and the Energy Department in identifying a laboratory mishap in Wuhan, China, as the probable source of the COVID virus. This tragedy has killed more than 1.2 million Americans and over 7 million people worldwide. The saddest part of the story is that the gain of function research that led to the development of this virus in Wuhan was likely partially funded by the US government. I note that more and more is becoming public about Anthony Fauci and his actions, this back in 2014. Note that these actions were always against federal policy. This is the reason Biden pardoned him on the way out the door. I'm glad to see that Trump recently struck the $400,000 a year being spent by the feds for bodyguards for Fauci. He can afford to pay for his own. And by the way, Trump also struck bodyguards for General Milley, and they're saying right now that Milley may get busted from a 4-star down to a 3-star. Interesting stuff, folks. Trump lists Biden's hold on the 2,000-pound bombs that were supposed to go to Israel. When Trump asked about this, he simply said, hey, they paid for them. This was part of the Biden effort prior to Trump getting into office to play both sides by preventing Israel from doing all it can to protect itself. Trump lists sanctions on Alaskan energy. This was something that should never have happened in the first place. Alaska is America's gold mine. One source notes that Alaska's GOP Senator Dan Sullivan lists as many as 70 Biden assaults on the state of Alaska. Biden's efforts to frustrate sensible efforts to utilize Alaska's natural resources never made any sense. In particular, Alaska has huge reserves of natural gas, which can be converted to LNG, a clean fuel which can be shipped around the world. Biden also blocked lease sales and other types of development. This may turn out to be one of the most positive developments for all Americans with the election of Trump. The tech-heavy NASDAQ, as they say, crashed recently due to the announcement of China's new AI model, DeepSeek. Technology stocks, including NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Tesla, lost $1 trillion in market value on fears that DeepSeek, which is much cheaper, would be a serious competitor in the AI space. The fear behind this silly sell-off was that the Red Chinese might be ahead of the USA in AI. Given that Congress voted last year to ban TikTok due to spying by the Chicoms, why on earth would any company or university want to risk their valuable data with something called DeepSeek? That is, if it's even competitive with current AI models. It is far too soon to tell. Note that NVIDIA's powerful AI chips are not supposed to be sold to China. While China claims that it is not using the chips, I've heard on the street that most likely, with near zero security in the United States, they were probably using those chips to create whatever they created, not some cheaper chips developed by the Chicoms. By the way, in the interest of full disclosure, I do own stock in NVIDIA and Tesla. I've been advocating for recycling for 50 years. I recall the first Earth Day and the early days of recycling home waste when I was a young college student in Philadelphia. Most of us recycle aluminum cans, various bottles, and cardboard. In some places, we're able to recycle certain plastics and even yard waste these days. Generally, while if you're patient, you might get a few dollars for aluminum cans. Most of the time, most of us don't bother to try and get paid for our recycling. However, a recent article noted that Target chain has announced that it might be possible to sell them some of your electronics. Target calls it the trade-in program. They will take used smartphones, tablets, smartwatches, smart speakers, headphones, video games, and video game consoles. This is great since I know I have a bunch of stuff taking up the closet space and I hate to throw the stuff in the trash. Go to Target website for details. And by the way, you get paid in Target credit. You don't get cash. It was noted that presently only 17% of electronic waste is being recycled. Note that Amazon, Best Buy, and Staples all have similar programs. This is Dr. David D. Schein. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of Saving America. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite site. Also, we always welcome comments from the audience. You can contact us through our website, ClaremontManagementGroup.com.